What you tell yourself in the morning quietly sets the direction of your entire day, long before the world has a chance to interfere. Before anyone speaks to you, before demands appear, before pressure shows up, there is an internal voice already shaping how you will walk into the day. Most people underestimate this moment. They wake up and immediately surrender it. They reach for their phone, absorb other people's thoughts, news, expectations, comparisons, and without realizing it, they allow their identity to be written by noise. The mind, still open and impressionable in the early hours, accepts whatever it is given. If the first message is stress, the body tightens. If it is doubt, energy drops. If it is resentment, patience shortens. By the time the day begins, the tone has already been set internally. The morning is not just a transition from sleep to activity. It is a programming window. Whatever story you repeat to yourself becomes the lens through which you interpret everything that follows. If you tell yourself you are tired, the body listens. If you tell yourself the day will be heavy, every obstacle feels larger. If you tell yourself you are already behind, urgency turns into anxiety. These are not just thoughts, they are instructions. The nervous system responds to language. Muscles respond to belief. Focus follows expectation. This is why two people can face the same day and experience it completely differently, not because the day changed, but because the inner dialogue did. When you intentionally choose your words in the morning, you interrupt unconscious patterns. You stop reacting and start leading yourself. Saying something simple, steady, and grounded can create space between stimulus and response. It reminds the mind that it does not need to rush, panic, or prove anything. It anchors attention in the present rather than dragging yesterday's failures or tomorrow's fears into the now. The words you repeat become a reference point. When pressure appears later in the day, the mind returns to what it was told earlier. If the foundation was calm, reactions slow down. If the foundation was disciplined, excuses lose their grip. Morning self-talk is not about hype or artificial positivity. It is about alignment. When your words reflect truth rather than emotion, you stabilize yourself. You don't need to feel confident to speak with clarity. You don't need certainty to choose steadiness. The act of speaking intentionally is already an act of control. Over time, this builds trust within yourself. You begin to experience that you can influence your internal state, regardless of external circumstances. That trust becomes strength. It reduces dependence on motivation and replaces it with consistency. The brain learns through repetition. What you say once may feel meaningless. What you say every morning becomes familiar. Familiar thoughts feel safe. Safe thoughts become default. Default thoughts become identity. This is how quiet sentences spoken in solitude eventually shape behavior, decisions, and outcomes. You start acting in ways that match what you have been telling yourself, not because you force it, but because it feels natural. Language becomes architecture. It builds the structure in which your habits live. Over time, mornings stop feeling chaotic. There is less resistance to starting, less internal negotiation, less friction between intention and action. You move with more clarity because you have already reminded yourself who you are and how you choose to show up. Even on difficult days, the damage is limited. A centered morning does not guarantee an easy day, but it creates resilience. It reduces emotional leakage. It keeps you from being dragged too far off course. This is why the first voice you hear each day should be your own. Not rushed, not emotional, not reactive, but deliberate and grounded. When you claim that moment consistently, you stop waking up into randomness. You wake up into direction. The day may still challenge you, interrupt you, and test you, but it no longer defines you. You meet it already established, already oriented. Already steady identity is not something that changes through wishful thinking or temporary inspiration. It is shaped quietly through repetition, through what you consistently choose to do when no one is watching, and what you repeatedly allow yourself to believe about who you are becoming. Discipline is the hidden force behind this shaping. Not bursts of effort, Not emotional highs, but steady, repeated action that slowly rewires behavior until it becomes natural. Most people misunderstand identity as something fixed, as if they are born into a version of themselves and must simply accept it. But identity is fluid in practice. It is constructed through behavior, and behavior is built through discipline, not motivation. Motivation is unstable. It rises and falls depending on mood, environment, and external stimulation. It cannot be trusted as a foundation because it disappears when it is needed most. Discipline, however, does not depend on how you feel. It depends on what you decide. Every time you act despite resistance, you reinforce a signal to your mind that your actions are not controlled by emotion. This repetition slowly weakens old patterns and strengthens new ones. Over time, what once felt difficult becomes automatic, not because the difficulty disappeared, but because your identity adapted to the repetition. When a person relies only on motivation, they remain in cycles of starting and stopping. They begin with excitement, then lose momentum when discomfort appears. This creates inconsistency, and inconsistency prevents identity formation. The mind cannot trust patterns that keep breaking. But when discipline enters the system, even in small amounts, it creates stability. That stability is what allows identity to evolve. You stop asking, "Do I feel like doing this?" and start acting from a different question. Is this who I am becoming? Identity is not built in moments of ease. It is built in moments of resistance. Every time you choose discipline over comfort, you are casting a vote for a new version of yourself. These votes may feel insignificant in isolation, but they accumulate. Waking up when it is uncomfortable, continuing when it is boring, focusing when distractions are available. These actions seem small, but they are structural. They are not just tasks, they are signals. Each one tells your mind, "This is how I behave now." Eventually, repetition reduces internal debate. At the beginning, discipline feels like effort because the identity is not aligned yet. There is friction between who you were and who you are becoming. But with enough repetition, that friction decreases. You no longer negotiate with yourself as much. The decision becomes faster. The resistance becomes quieter. What once required force begins to require less thought. This is the point where discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like structure. As discipline deepens, confidence begins to shift. It is no longer based on outcomes or external validation, but on self-trust. You start to trust that you will do what you said you would do. This trust is more powerful than temporary success because it is internal. It does not depend on applause or results. It depends on alignment between intention and action. When that alignment becomes consistent, identity stabilizes. You no longer need to prove who you are, because your behavior already expresses it. Most people underestimate how identity resists change at first. The old version of you does not disappear immediately. It resists through habits, excuses, and emotional pull toward comfort. This is why discipline is not a one-time decision, but a repeated confrontation. Each day you are reinforcing a direction, either forward into structure or backward into familiarity. There is no neutral position. Even inaction reinforces the old identity because it preserves existing patterns over time. Disciplined action begins to shape perception itself. You start to see yourself differently because evidence accumulates. You are no longer imagining change, you are observing it. And once the mind has enough evidence, it stops questioning. It begins to accept the new identity as reality. At that stage, discipline is no longer external pressure, it becomes internal expectation. You do not act disciplined to become someone new. You act disciplined because that is already who you are becoming. In practice, calm response is one of the most overlooked forms of power because it does not announce itself loudly, it does not seek attention, and it does not rely on external validation to prove its strength. It exists in the space between what happens to you and how you choose to react. Most people surrender that space without realizing it. They react immediately, emotionally, impulsively, allowing circumstances to dictate their internal state. In that moment, control is lost, not because the situation was uncontrollable, but because the response was unguarded. True authority begins when you learn to pause internally. Even if everything outside is moving fast when emotions take over, perception becomes distorted. A small problem feels large, a delay feels like failure, a disagreement feels like threat. This distortion does not come from the situation itself, but from the lack of space between stimulus and reaction. Calmness restores that space. It allows clarity to return before action is taken. In that space, you are no longer a passenger of your emotions, you become the observer of them. You see anger rise without becoming it. You notice frustration without obeying it. This shift alone changes the entire structure of how you move through life. Calm response does not mean suppression of emotion. It does not mean pretending nothing affects you. It means acknowledging what is happening internally without letting it dictate behavior. The feeling may arise, but the reaction is chosen. This distinction is where inner authority is built. Without it, a person becomes reactive, constantly pulled by external triggers. With it, a person becomes stable, less predictable to chaos, and more grounded in decision-making. When you respond calmly, you also protect your energy. Emotional reactions consume mental resources quickly. They create tension, fatigue, and unnecessary internal conflict. Calmness, on the other hand, preserves energy for what actually matters. It reduces noise in the mind, allowing focus to remain on solutions rather than emotional escalation. Problems do not disappear, but your capacity to handle them increases because your attention is not fragmented by reaction. There is also a deeper psychological shift that occurs with calm response. It changes how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself. Externally, calmness signals control. It communicates that you are not easily shaken, not easily manipulated, not easily pulled into chaos. Internally, it builds self-respect. Each time you remain steady under pressure, you reinforce trust in your own stability. That trust becomes a foundation. You start believing not just that you can handle easy situations, but that you can remain composed even when things are uncertain. Calmness is not weakness, even though it is often mistaken for passivity. It is restraint combined with awareness. It is the ability to hold back immediate reaction in favor of intentional response. This restraint is what separates impulse from intelligence. Many mistakes in life are not caused by lack of knowledge, but by lack of emotional control in the moment of decision. A calm mind sees options more clearly, while a reactive mind sees only urgency in high-pressure moments. Calmness becomes even more important. When stress rises, the mind narrows its focus, often exaggerating threat and minimizing possibility. Calm response widens that focus again. It allows perspective to return. Instead of being trapped inside the problem, you begin to step slightly outside of it mentally, which creates room for better decisions. This is why calm individuals often appear more effective under pressure, not because they feel less, but because they process more clearly over time. Calm response becomes a trained behavior rather than a forced effort. At first, it requires conscious control, reminding yourself not to react immediately. But with repetition, it becomes automatic. The mind learns that reaction is not the first option, reflection is. This shift changes your entire relationship with conflict, stress, and uncertainty. Life continues to present challenges, but your internal state is no longer dictated by their intensity. There is a quiet strength in not being easily disturbed. It is not visible in dramatic moments, but it is evident in consistency. While others fluctuate with circumstances, calm response creates stability. And in that stability, decisions become clearer, relationships become steadier, and personal direction becomes more defined. Not because external life becomes easier, but because internal reaction becomes controlled. Consistent, small actions carry a power that most people underestimate because they are conditioned to look for dramatic change rather than quiet accumulation. Big efforts feel impressive in the moment, but they are often rare, unstable, and emotionally driven. Small actions, when repeated, create structure. They build something that does not rely on mood or inspiration, but on rhythm. The human mind naturally gravitates toward what feels significant, yet real transformation rarely comes from intensity. It comes from repetition that seems ordinary while it is happening, but becomes extraordinary in hindsight. When a person focuses only on large actions, progress becomes inconsistent. There are moments of high energy where effort feels easy, followed by long periods of inactivity when motivation fades. This cycle creates the illusion of movement without actual direction. Consistent small actions break this cycle because they are designed to be sustainable. They do not demand perfection, only continuity. Even when energy is low, they are still possible. Even when motivation disappears, they remain accessible. This is what makes them powerful. They survive emotional fluctuation. The mind tends to dismiss small actions because their impact is not immediately visible. But invisibility is not the same as insignificance. What appears small on the surface is often reshaping internal structure beneath it. Every repeated action reinforces a neural pathway, strengthening the behavior associated with it. Over time, what once required effort becomes automatic. This is how identity quietly forms through repetition that does not feel dramatic while it is happening. Consistency creates accumulation, and accumulation creates change that cannot be easily reversed. One small action may not seem meaningful, but repeated hundreds of times, it becomes a pattern. That pattern begins to define behavior, and behavior defines outcomes. The difference between where someone is and where they want to be is often not a single breakthrough moment, but the presence or absence of repeated small decisions over time. What is done daily matters more than what is done occasionally, even if the occasional effort feels more intense. There is also a psychological benefit to small, consistent actions. They reduce resistance. When a task feels too large, the mind creates excuses to avoid it. But when the task is small enough to feel manageable, resistance weakens. This allows action to begin without internal conflict. Once action begins, momentum naturally builds, not because the task became easier, but because starting removed the weight of avoidance. The real barrier is often not difficulty, but initiation. Small actions also build trust within yourself. Every time you follow through on something simple, you reinforce the belief that your word to yourself has value. This internal trust is more important than external validation. It becomes the foundation for larger commitments later. If you cannot trust yourself with small actions, larger goals will always feel fragile. But when small actions are consistently honored, confidence becomes a byproduct of behavior rather than emotion over time. The accumulation of small actions creates visible change that feels sudden to others but gradual to you. People may notice transformation and assume it happened quickly, but internally, it is the result of countless repetitions that were too small to be celebrated individually. This is why discipline often looks simple from the outside but feels demanding from within. The effort is not in intensity, but in persistence. There is also a quiet compounding effect at work. Just as neglect accumulates into decline, consistency accumulates into growth. A small improvement maintained daily does not stay small. It expands, it compounds, it multiplies its influence across time. The difference between stagnation and transformation is often not effort level, but continuity. What is repeated shapes direction more than what is intended eventually. Consistent small actions stop feeling like effort and start feeling like identity. You no longer debate whether to do them because they become part of how you operate. They are no longer separate decisions but integrated behavior. At that point, change is no longer something you are trying to achieve. It is something that is already unfolding through repetition that continues quietly, without interruption. Fear is often misunderstood as something that must disappear before action can begin. But in reality, fear rarely leaves completely. It changes shape, it shifts intensity, but it remains present whenever you move towards something uncertain or meaningful. The idea that confidence is the absence of fear creates unnecessary pressure, because it suggests that you must wait for a perfect internal state before you can move forward. In truth, growth begins when you move with fear, not when you eliminate it. Fear is a natural response to the unknown. It is the mind's way of trying to protect you from discomfort, failure, or loss. But protection, when overused, becomes limitation. The same mechanism that is designed to keep you safe can also keep you stagnant. When fear is followed without question, it begins to define boundaries that are far smaller than your actual potential. It convinces you that hesitation is safety, when in reality hesitation is often just delay disguised as caution. What most people do not realize is that fear loses strength through movement. It grows stronger when avoided and weaker when faced. When you repeatedly step toward what you fear, even in small ways, your mind begins to reevaluate the threat. What once felt overwhelming becomes familiar. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. The situation itself may not change, but your internal relationship with it does. This shift is what transforms fear from a barrier into a signal. Fear does not need to be erased in order for progress to happen. It needs to be redefined. Instead of interpreting fear as a stop sign, it can be understood as an indicator that something important is being approached. If there is no fear at all, there is often no growth either, because comfort rarely requires expansion. The presence of fear can actually confirm that you are moving beyond what is familiar. The key is not to wait for fear to disappear, but to act while it is still present. When action happens in the presence of fear, something important changes internally. The mind begins to separate feeling from behavior. You learn that emotion is not a command, it is an experience. Fear may still be felt, but it no longer dictates direction. This separation is what builds psychological strength. It creates a gap between impulse and action where choice becomes possible. In that gap, discipline is formed. Every time you act despite fear, you weaken its authority. Not the feeling itself, but its control over your decisions. The fear may still arise, but it no longer decides the outcome. This repeated experience slowly rewires your response system. What used to stop you begins to simply accompany you. It is still there, but it no longer leads. You do fear also shrinks when it is delayed. The longer you hesitate, the larger it appears in your mind. The imagination fills in gaps with worst-case scenarios, exaggerating consequences that may never occur. But when action is taken quickly, before overthinking fully develops, fear does not have time to expand. This is why hesitation often feels heavier than action. The anticipation of fear is usually more intense than the experience itself. There is a turning point that occurs when fear is no longer treated as a warning to retreat, but as a condition to move through. At that point, courage is no longer a dramatic act. It becomes a quiet decision to continue despite discomfort. It is not about feeling brave. It is about refusing to let fear make the final decision. This shift changes identity over time. You stop being someone who waits to feel ready and become someone who acts while still uncertain. As this pattern continues, fear loses its ability to define limits. It still appears, but it no longer determines direction. Action becomes independent of emotional approval. You begin to trust movement more than hesitation, and in that trust, fear becomes background noise rather than a controlling force. Present, but no longer leading the path forward. Fear is often misunderstood as something that must disappear before action can begin, but in reality, fear rarely leaves completely. It changes shape, it shifts intensity, but it remains present whenever you move towards something uncertain or meaningful. The idea that confidence is the absence of fear creates unnecessary pressure, because it suggests that you must wait for a perfect internal state before you can move forward. In truth, growth begins when you move with fear, not when you eliminate it. Fear is a natural response to the unknown. It is the mind's way of trying to protect you from discomfort, failure, or loss. But protection, when overused, becomes limitation. The same mechanism that is designed to keep you safe can also keep you stagnant. When fear is followed without question, it begins to define boundaries that are far smaller than your actual potential. It convinces you that hesitation is safety, when in reality hesitation is often just delay disguised as caution. What most people do not realize is that fear loses strength through movement. It grows stronger when avoided and weaker when faced. When you repeatedly step toward what you fear, even in small ways, your mind begins to reevaluate the threat. What once felt overwhelming becomes familiar. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. The situation itself may not change, but your internal relationship with it does. This shift is what transforms fear from a barrier into a signal. Fear does not need to be erased in order for progress to happen. It needs to be redefined. Instead of interpreting fear as a stop sign, it can be understood as an indicator that something important is being approached. If there is no fear at all, there is often no growth either, because comfort rarely requires expansion. The presence of fear can actually confirm that you are moving beyond what is familiar. The key is not to wait for fear to disappear, but to act while it is still present. When action happens in the presence of fear, something important changes internally. The mind begins to separate feeling from behavior. You learn that emotion is not a command, it is an experience. Fear may still be felt, but it no longer dictates direction. This separation is what builds psychological strength. It creates a gap between impulse and action where choice becomes possible. In that gap, discipline is formed. Every time you act despite fear, you weaken its authority, not the feeling itself, but its control over your decisions. The fear may still arise, but it no longer decides the outcome. This repeated experience slowly rewires your response system. What used to stop you begins to simply accompany you. It is still there, but it no longer leads. Fear also shrinks when it is delayed. The longer you hesitate, the larger it appears in your mind. The imagination fills in gaps with worst-case scenarios, exaggerating consequences that may never occur. But when action is taken quickly, before overthinking fully develops, fear does not have time to expand. This is why hesitation often feels heavier than action. The anticipation of fear is usually more intense than the experience itself. There is a turning point that occurs when fear is no longer treated as a warning to retreat, but as a condition to move through. At that point, courage is no longer a dramatic act. It becomes a quiet decision to continue despite discomfort. It is not about feeling brave, it is about refusing to let fear make the final decision. This shift changes identity over time. You stop being someone who waits to feel ready and become someone who acts while still uncertain. As this pattern continues, fear loses its ability to define limits. It still appears, but it no longer determines direction. Action becomes independent of emotional approval. You begin to trust movement more than hesitation. And in that trust, fear becomes background noise rather than a controlling force. Present, but no longer leading the path forward. Self-respect is not something that is created through self-image alone, nor through how a person wishes to be seen, but through the alignment between what is said and what is actually done. Every time you make a promise to yourself, even in a small moment, a silent agreement is formed. That agreement either becomes stronger or weaker, depending on whether your actions match your words. When there is consistency between intention and behavior, something stabilizes internally. When there is a gap between what is declared and what is followed through, that same stability begins to weaken in ways that are not immediately visible, but gradually felt in how you perceive yourself. Words are easy to produce, but actions carry weight. The mind can declare change instantly, but behavior takes time to adjust. This gap between declaration and execution is where self-respect is either built or eroded. When a person repeatedly says they will do something and does not follow through, the mind quietly records that pattern. It does not need external judgment to form an internal conclusion. Over time, it begins to trust words less. Not because words have no meaning, but because they are no longer supported by evidence. When words and actions align, there is no internal contradiction. That absence of contradiction creates clarity. The mind does not need to negotiate between intention and reality. This reduces internal noise. A person begins to feel more grounded because there is no constant conflict between what they claim to value and what they actually prioritize in behavior. This alignment is not about perfection, but about direction. Even when mistakes happen, the return to alignment matters more than constant flawlessness. Self-respect is deeply connected to follow-through. Every time you do what you said you would do, even in a small task, you reinforce trust in yourself. This trust is not built through grand achievements alone, but through ordinary moments where discipline is maintained. Waking up when you said you would, completing what you started, choosing effort when ease was available. These moments quietly accumulate into a sense of reliability within yourself. That reliability becomes the foundation of how you relate to your own identity. When there is misalignment, something subtle shifts internally. A person may continue speaking about their intentions, but internally there is less conviction behind those words. Over time, excuses become more frequent, not necessarily because the goals have changed, but because the mind has learned that words are not always followed by action. This creates a fragmentation in identity. One part of the self continues to declare direction, while another part quietly expects inconsistency. That internal split weakens confidence, not in an obvious way, but in a gradual reduction of self-trust. Alignment does not require intensity, it requires consistency. It is not about doing everything perfectly, but about reducing the distance between what is said and what is done. Even small corrections matter. Choosing to act when previously there was hesitation. Choosing to follow through when previously there was delay. Choosing to remain consistent when previously there was avoidance. Each of these moments closes the gap slightly. Over time, the gap becomes smaller until words begin to naturally reflect behavior, rather than intention alone. There is also a quiet shift in how others perceive someone whose words and actions align. There is less need for explanation, less need for justification, because behavior already communicates reliability. However, the deeper impact remains internal. Self-respect grows in silence, not through recognition, but through internal agreement. The mind begins to recognize that what is said will likely be done, and what is done reflects what is truly valued. When misalignment continues for long periods, even small promises begin to feel heavy, not because they are difficult, but because trust has been weakened internally. When alignment becomes the norm, even larger challenges feel more manageable because the foundation of self-trust is already present. This trust does not depend on outcomes, but on consistency of behavior over time, where repetition slowly reshapes identity into something more unified, where intention and action begin to move closer together in daily repetition. In the end, everything returns to one simple truth. The life you experience is shaped far more by your internal discipline than external circumstances. What you tell yourself in the morning, how consistently you act, how calmly you respond, how steadily you move through fear, and how closely your words match your actions, all of it quietly builds the structure of who you become. Nothing changes in a single moment, but everything changes through repeated direction. There is no sudden transformation that replaces effort, only a gradual shift created by what you choose again and again when no one is watching. The mind follows repetition, identity follows behavior, and life follows identity. When your mornings are intentional, your discipline is steady, your responses are controlled, your actions are consistent. Your courage is active even in fear, and your integrity is aligned. You stop living reactively and start living deliberately. Change does not come from waiting for the right feeling. It comes from acting with clarity, even when feelings are uncertain. It comes from returning to alignment even after moments of imbalance. It comes from continuing when motivation fades and trusting structure more than emotion over time. What once felt difficult becomes natural. What once required effort becomes identity. And what once felt like change becomes the way you live without questioning it anymore.